Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Ronin seminar series. And our presenter today is our Ronin scholar, Stéphanie Cassilde, who is currently in Belgium. Stephanie is a developing economist and a sociologist, and she focuses on the interaction between language and space. And today she will introduce her research work to us. So I see that you're all muted already. If you have questions for Stephanie, you don't want to, that they come up and you don't want to forget, you can type them up in the chat room. And then at the end of our presentation, we'll open up the floor for discussion. So Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Gloria. Thank you for creating this seminar. Thank you to all of you to remotely joining this seminar. I will share with you research co-authors with a colleague based in France, Kelly Labarre. And I will share both the research, but also the first step of how we reach this question, and also which is the current stage of this research and the future steps. And so the title of the presentation is From Multilingualism to Plurilingualism, to build a linguistic fragmentation index. So how the idea comes, actually, we were sharing our own research, and Kelly was doing a literature review about critiques about the index I will present to you later. And at the same time, I was confronted with a new living context, because I was not in France anymore, but I was living in Luxembourg. And I was witnessing daily linguistic interaction of huge diversity of language in daily life. And daily life means that there are 3 official languages in Luxembourg, 3 national languages, but also that all administrative documents are produced and shared in these 3 national languages, which are French, German, and Luxembourgish, but also in English and in Portuguese. English because they are international civil servants in Luxembourg, and Portuguese because it's the main huge foreign or linguistically foreign community in Luxembourg. And in daily life, you can hear Italian, almost a lot of language in the daily interaction. And at the same time, I was at this time working on a data set which has some item related to language. So I was not working on language at this time, but on cultural practices, and some data were available for this. And then I was also witnessing the case of Luxembourg, which did not fit the literature we were discussing with Kelly during her literature review. And so the question was why and how, and if with this available data set we may ask or answer this question. And so we started this work together. And so what is the literature about? It's anchored mainly in developing economics literature. And actually, there is a seminal paper of Easterly and Levine. The year is 1997. And the main finding was a correlation between a high fragmentation. So basically, the meaning of the high fragmentation was high diversity of language for them, with very low economic outcome. And it opened the floor for a huge body of literature, and several authors started to use exactly the same index and found a correlation with a high fragmentation index, and at the same time, poor social participation, civil war, poor economic performance, and so on. And at the same time, in parallel, a body of literature arises also in relation to the critique of this index and what it is actually measuring and how it is measuring it, and also because the conclusion of the finding are extremely strong. And using other index, sometimes the sign of the effect was changing, sometimes not. But also there was a lot of research in microeconomics underlying that diversity of languages actually may be a positive asset. And especially in developing economic literature, the strong implications are for the African countries, because in these countries there was the highest diversity of language. And so if we take for granted that high fragmentation, a high diversity of language is linked with poor economic outcomes, then a consequence in relation to public policy may be to try to reduce or not to use some languages. So it's extremely important for the effect in the real world. And so it's a body of literature quite active and with quite a lot of fight inside it. And so at this time, and knowing that, I was in Luxembourg with the highest GDP per capita, with a huge diversity of language. And it was like a crucial case of maybe it doesn't work, or how we can explain the case of Luxembourg and why the usual ELF index is not shedding light from this perspective. And maybe we are missing something, and maybe what we are missing can be missing for the African countries too. And so to help me this work, I used TRIM's definition of multilingualism and plurilingualism, just to be clear, because behind multilingualism, sometimes we may find various definitions, and so I'm using TRIM's definition to set the framework. And for TRIM, multilingualism is that there are various languages coexisting in the same space. And plurilingualism is the skill of somebody to speak several languages. And this is a very different, very important distinction, because we can have, let us say, 3 groups speaking each one a given language, and then we can say there is multilingualism because there are 3 languages in the same group, but we will use plurilingualism only if somebody may speak at least 2 of the 3 languages in the group. And so regarding the existing ELF index, I will present just in the next slide. My objective was to shift from use of multilingualism only to plurilingualism. So here are the formula. I show them not to explain them in detail, but I show them because in order to share the formula, but I will explain them with words. So the first ethno-linguistic fragmentation index, the first formula was created by Taylor and Hudson. And it's actually the probability that 2 persons randomly chosen in a group, in that case in a country, speak the same language or not. And so the index is between 0 and 1, and the closer to 1, the most fragmented. The closer to 0, the less fragmented. So I chose 2 randomly person, and do they speak the same language or not? And to compute this index for various countries, actually the authors, and not only them, but also all application of the formula actually, and so this was the formula used for the seminal paper I spoke just before. They uses the share of people speaking one of the main national language. So for instance, if there is one national language, or if there is 2, 3, 5 administrative languages, they will use this share in order to compute this index. And so they are taking people are speaking only one language, and each person in the population, in the big N, will be attributed to one group of languages without possibility to change. And this was not satisfying for several authors, and so the formula evolved with a theorem computation. And he introduced the fact that we should take into account a cultural dimension. And that means that languages can be more or less close to each other. And so if some languages are closer than other languages, then you need to correct the capability of the person to exchange between each other. But still, the formula use the share, so consider the group as excluding one from another on the basis of one language use. And there was a generalized fragmentation index introduced by Bossert et al., which enable to gather those formula and work in both sense. And so for the pluri-ethno-linguistic fragmentation index, created on the basis of the case of Luxembourg, the idea was as follows. Instead of focusing on the share at the national level, we will look at what people are doing with languages in their daily life. So do they speak 1 or 2 languages or more? So the formula is conceived so that we have no limitation regarding the number of languages. Then in the application, as only 2 languages were documented, we already know that it's the best estimation we can have, but it's still not fully accurate in order to take the whole plurilingualism skills of people. But at least we focus on what people are doing in their daily life. And so for the computation, we still use exclusive group, but the exclusive group will be determined in another way than the share among the population. And so in order to explain that, I make this drawing. So on the left, we have, for instance, 3 national languages in a country. And for ELF index, we will conceive the share of each of the 3 languages. For the PELF index, the Pluri-ethno-linguistic fragmentation index, we will actually build a 6 group, so using a combinatory. That is to say that some people will still be monolingual, only speak the language 1, language 2, and language 3, but other people will speak mostly language 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 2 and 3. And taking that into account, I still have an exclusive group for the computation, but I'm taking into account that they have plurilingual skill in their daily life and amongst their linguistic interaction. The implication of this formula is that we need specific data which are not microdata about the share of languages among the population, which can be also computed on microdata, but still used at the more global level, at the country level. But I will focus on daily linguistic practices. And so I need to ask each one in the sample, which is the first language they use the most, which is the second language they use the most, etc. So why choosing the case of Luxembourg to deal with that? So the truth, as I said from the beginning, was the opportunity of the available data and being confronted with this case and trying to confront it to what was said in the literature. The second truth is that using the case of Luxembourg enable, I'm not sure about the accurate translation. In French is a démonstration par l'absurde, demonstration by the absurd. This is a crucial case which enable to ask in a different way the question. Indeed, there are huge differences with African countries and mainly in relation to the GDP, for instance. But from another perspective, there are a lot of similarities between Luxembourg and some African countries regarding the areas, the number of inhabitants, no access to the sea. And actually, we may see in the table that some countries have also the same kind of number of languages from one point of view, which is how many national languages or institutional languages, etc. But also there are a lot of diversity among these African countries. Of course, in the research done in the body of literature, the fragmentation index was not the single explanatory variable. There was a lot of other variable, but this variable was significant. And the question is about what can be said about this index being significant and what arises when we change the index. And so Luxembourg is quite a convenient case to ask the question. So I used the cultural practice data set, which were collected in 2009. So the question was, which are the first and the second language spoken in 3 contexts, the most spoken language by each individual in the sample, with the family, at work, and with friends. So that means that we really try to focus on real practice and not on theoretical practice, for instance, on the basis of educational attainment to a given language, etc. Because somebody can be very good in a language, but if there is nobody else to speak it, it won't be spoken. And so as also one reason of dealing with linguistic fragmentation was also related to the communication cost. So it makes sense to focus on real practices to see if people are able to exchange or not. So as said, I only have two languages here, but it's more than one, and I hope I can find a data set with more languages documented. And so here is also the result of the table. And in the table, of course, with the same data set, we compute again the usual ethno-linguistic fragmentation index, and then we apply the pluri-ethno-linguistic fragmentation index. Why? In order to see if with the same data set to have like an anchor between the body of literature already existing, which use ELF index, and the newly proposed indexed. And we can see that when we use our data set with the usual formula, we reach similar, the figures are similar. So it's a high fragmentation. It's close to 1. Of course, there's a little difference between at work and with friends, or with friends at home, but globally it's quite high. And if we look at the pluri-ethno-linguistic fragmentation index, we can see, as expected, that when we take into account the plurilingualism, the observed or the documented linguistic interaction, there is a huge decrease, and especially at work, especially with friends, and less with the family, which can be explained with a closer cultural and linguistic environment, and so maybe less diversity, but much more diversity with friends and at work. So this is quite, this was the theoretically expected result, and in the case of Luxembourg with the data, we indeed reach this result. So the categorization of Luxembourg changes from the ethno-linguistic fragmentation to the pluri-ethno-linguistic fragmentation index. And now we are facing a country which is not considered as fragmented anymore, but still with all the other features unchanged. Huge GDP per capita, the share of education, etc. And of course, one question now is, what can we obtain if we apply this index, the formula, to other countries, and especially to African countries? Is that possible to observe so huge differences and so huge change, and another categorization of the countries according to the change of the index? Also, the question is how to interpret the difference between both indexes, because still the first index gave us information, and the way we interpret the differences in our discussion of the result was to question the linguistic cohesion among the country. And so from this perspective, the linguistic cohesion in Luxembourg is very high when it's related to work and with friendship, less when it is related to the family, but still we observe a decrease from the first index to the index we are offering, taking into account plurilingualism. And so this was the end of the paper that we wrote and published together. And then the question is how to continue this work, this research. And this is also related of why it took so much time between the computation of the result and the publication, because I confess a lot of doubts or hesitation, because at the same time it's interesting per se to offer a new index and to discuss it and to share it. And from the other side, in the body of literature, the existing body of literature, just discussing such a way the index is not enough. because as the articles are all related to measuring the correlation or the causality of the index on another outcome, dealing only with the crucial case was not enough. And this is why there was so many hesitation so many times. But finally, we decided to proceed this way. And now the objective is to build a whole pluriethnolinguistic fragmentation dataset in order to offer the data for as many countries as possible, and so that people who are researchers who are working on different economic outcomes may use it and check how the result change or not, to continue and actually to reach the result of the very initial question. And to do that, in the forthcoming November, I will do a research stay in Eurolab JASIS in order to compute this index for the maximum of country. And so some challenges are ongoing because one key challenge is related to harmonized data. So at Eurolab, the data will be harmonized, but maybe I won't be able to have the same item as for Luxembourg. And so I will need more discussion and more reflection about how the pluriethnolinguistic fragmentation index is computed, because it makes sense to use daily practices, daily linguistic interaction, but if they are not available, maybe I will deal with the level of languages of people, and then there is something to think about between the confrontation between daily practices and theoretical skills, and what is really the meaning of this in this context and in relation to the initial research question. And then maybe I will be the one who will be able to do that, but maybe not. At least the first test will be to share as much as possible this data set, and that if I can to reproduce previous research using this index. Also, I focused a lot on the linguistic part for this presentation, and also in the case of the study of the crucial case of Luxembourg, but there is a E in ethno-linguistic fragmentation for the ethno part, and I think it's also very, very important question because ethnicity are conceived as completely separated from each other. But in several countries is now possible for the country who are documented it, because it's not collected in all countries, but in the country who are dealing with related data, which can be about ethnicity or other way to aggregate or to build groups among countries. People can also belong to several groups, actually. And I think it would be very interesting also to find a way to study this part too. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward for your question.
Thank you, Stephanie.